But when the judge read what my daughter-in-law had been doing for the past 11 months, there wasn't a single person in that courtroom who could look her in the eye. At the Thanksgiving table, my daughter-in-law stood up, pointed her finger directly at my face, and said, "Get out of my house. You are not allowed near my grandchildren ever again." The police were there within 15 minutes, and I spent that night in a jail cell at 67 years old, wondering how the family I had spent my entire life building had just been turned into a weapon against me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really started, because the truth is, none of this happened overnight. It was built, piece by piece, by someone I had welcomed into my family with open arms. My name is Walter Briggs. I'm 67 years old, a retired high school history teacher from Clarksville, Tennessee, and for the last 3 years since my wife Pauline passed, my son Robert and his 2 daughters have been my whole reason for getting up in the morning. Lily is 8 years old and has her grandmother's eyes. Sophie is 11 and has my stubborn streak, which her father never lets me forget. Every Thursday evening, I would drive the 12 minutes from my house to theirs, bring whatever cookies Pauline's old recipe box suggested that week, and spend a few hours just being their grandfather. I want you to understand what those evenings meant to me. After 41 years of marriage, losing Pauline left a silence in my house so heavy I could feel it pressing on my chest every morning. Robert knew this. He would call me on the drive home from those visits and say, "Dad, the girls talked about you the whole time after you left." Those phone calls kept me going. Vanessa came into Robert's life about 2 years after Pauline passed. She was sharp and confident, and I could see why my son was drawn to her. I made every effort. I brought her flowers the first time we met for dinner. I complimented her cooking, which honestly deserved the compliment. When they got engaged, I told Robert she seemed like a woman who knew exactly what she wanted, and I meant it as a kindness. I did not yet understand how right I was. The first sign I missed was so small I didn't even register it until much later. It was a Sunday afternoon, about 3 months after the wedding. I had brought Lily a book about horses because she'd been asking about riding lessons, and I had gotten Sophie a small telescope because she had mentioned wanting to look at stars. Vanessa watched me hand over the gifts from the kitchen doorway with an expression I couldn't quite name at the time. Later I would recognize it as calculation. "Walter," she said pleasantly, "you really don't have to bring gifts every single time. The girls might start to expect it." I laughed it off. I told her that was what grandfathers were for. She smiled and said nothing else. But after that, the visits started feeling different. Small things. Robert would be out running errands more often when I arrived, leaving me alone with the girls and Vanessa hovering nearby, sometimes walking through the room to observe without saying a word. She began making comments in front of the children, nothing outrageous, just small, precise little notions she planted and left to grow. "Girls, Grandpa's getting older. You have to be careful not to wear him out. Walter, are you sure you should be lifting Sophie? Your back isn't what it used to be. Isn't it a little cold outside for Grandpa to take you to the park? We don't want him getting confused driving back in the dark." I told myself she was being considerate. I told myself I was being oversensitive. I was a 67-year-old man, and these were perfectly reasonable things for someone to say. That is how it works. I now understand. The manipulation is reasonable until it isn't, and by the time you realize something is wrong, it's already been going on so long that you can't identify when it started. The Thursday visits became bi-weekly, then monthly. Vanessa always had a reason. The girls had activities. Robert was tired from work. The house was being cleaned. I stopped suggesting visits and started waiting to be invited, which is exactly where she wanted me. Then came last November, the Thanksgiving that ended my life as I knew it. Vanessa had organized the dinner and insisted I come. That surprised me, because by then, our relationship had cooled to something barely warmer than formal. But she called herself, which was unusual, and she said, "Walter, the girls have been asking for you. We'd love to have you." I was so relieved I didn't stop to wonder why. The dinner itself seemed fine on the surface. Turkey, sweet potatoes, Pauline's cornbread recipe that I had shared with Robert years ago. Lily sat next to me and kept resting her head against my arm between bites, the way she used to do when she was 5. Sophie challenged me to name 5 presidents in under 10 seconds, which I did, and then made her do the same. I remember thinking, this is what I needed. This is what I'd been missing. Then Sophie spilled cranberry sauce on her sleeve and started to cry because it was a new sweater. I reached over with my napkin and helped her blot it, the same way I had wiped down scraped knees and chocolate-covered chins 1,000 times over the years. A completely normal grandfather moment. Vanessa's chair scraped back from the table so fast that Lily flinched. "Don't touch her." Her voice was flat and loud, and it silenced every sound in the room, including the football game on television in the background. "Get your hands away from my daughter." I froze with the napkin still in my hand. Robert stared at his wife. Both girls looked terrified. "Vanessa, I was just helping her with the—" "I know exactly what you were doing." She pointed her finger at me across the Thanksgiving table like she was reading a verdict. "I've been watching you for months, Walter. The way you always have to touch them. The way you insist on being alone with them. You and Sophie in the basement last month. You and Lily in her bedroom reading. Behind a closed door." "You told me to close the door," I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. "You said she needed quiet because she had a headache. I want you out of this house." She already had her phone in her hand. "And I'm calling the police because I'm not letting you near these children for one more minute." Robert said her name, just once. She looked at him with an expression that made him go quiet, and that silence from my own son felt like the floor dropping out from under me. The girls were crying. Sophie had her arms wrapped around herself. Lily was staring at me with wide, confused eyes, and in that moment, I wanted to reassure her more than anything in the world. But I understood, with sudden cold clarity, that if I reached for her, it would be used against me. The police arrived while I was still standing in the hallway with my coat half on, too stunned to fully process what was happening. Vanessa met them at the door and spoke with the composed, specific certainty of someone who had rehearsed this. She said I had been exhibiting concerning behavior with the children for months. She said she had documentation. She said she feared for her daughter's safety. I kept waiting for Robert to say something. He stood in the living room doorway with his arms crossed, and he would not look at me. They put handcuffs on me in my son's foyer. I am 67 years old. I have never been arrested in my life. I taught American history to 16-year-olds for 31 years. I coached Little League. I served on the church deacon board. And I stood there in my son's house in handcuffs while my granddaughters cried somewhere I couldn't see them. On Thanksgiving night, the county jail is a particular kind of darkness when you're accused of what I was accused of. I won't spend too long describing it because even now it sits in my chest like a stone, but I will tell you this. By my second morning, every man in that facility knew exactly why the old man in the corner bunk was there. I spent most of my time with my back against the wall and my eyes open. I prayed more in those 72 hours than I had in the 20 years prior. My court-appointed attorney was a young woman named Stacy who had kind eyes and a caseload that was clearly crushing her. She sat across from me in the visitation room with a folder that seemed far too thin and told me, in the gentlest way possible, that these cases were very difficult to defend. She told me Vanessa had submitted a written statement with specific dates and incidents. She told me the prosecution was suggesting there might be more evidence forthcoming. I asked her what kind of evidence. She told me they had retrieved my phone from my jacket pocket when I was booked. There were photographs on it of the children in what was being described as private situations. I felt the room tilt sideways. I explained that the photographs were from 3 months prior when Lily had developed a severe rash on her arms and legs from a reaction to something in the garden. Vanessa herself had asked me to document it because Robert was traveling for work and she wanted to send images to the pediatrician without driving to the office. I had 16 photographs of a child's allergic rash taken at her mother's specific request, and they were about to be presented as predatory evidence. Stacy nodded and wrote something down and told me we would need to establish context. Then she mentioned a plea arrangement that would reduce the charge to something that would follow me for the rest of my life, and I told her firmly and clearly that I would not plead guilty to something I had not done. That night I tried to call Robert 4 times. It rang through to voicemail every single time. The isolation was its own particular cruelty. Pauline was gone. Robert had gone silent. My neighbors didn't know what to say, and most of them said nothing, which amounted to the same thing. My brother Dale drove down from Kentucky and sat with me in the visitation room and told me he believed me, but I could see him turning something over in his mind, and that uncertainty from the man who had known me since birth was more painful than anything Vanessa had done. A week into my incarceration, Robert came to see me. He looked like he hadn't slept. He sat down across the glass from me and said, "Dad, I need you to tell me the truth." And I said, "Son, I have never told you anything but—" He nodded and didn't say anything for a long time. When he left, he still hadn't told me what he believed. 12 days after my arrest, a letter arrived from Robert. My hands shook as I opened it. It was 4 sentences. He said he was trying to process everything. He said the girls were asking about me and he didn't know what to tell them. He said, please don't attempt to contact them while things were being sorted out. He didn't sign it with love. He just signed his name. That night I considered giving up. Not fighting. Just taking whatever sentence came and disappearing into whatever remained of my life afterward. What was the point of a future built on a name that had been permanently blackened? Then I thought about Lily, who rested her head on my arm at dinner. I thought about Sophie, who made me name presidents and laughed when I beat her time. I thought about them growing up carrying the weight of believing their grandfather was the thing Vanessa had said he was. I thought about how that shame would shape them. I made a decision that night that I would not let Vanessa's lie become my grandchildren's truth. The next morning I asked for a different attorney. Her name was Margaret Holloway, and she was 53 years old with silver-streaked hair cut short and a manner that reminded me, painfully but comfortingly, of Pauline when she had made up her mind about something. She sat down across from me, looked at me without flinching, and asked me one question. Mr. Briggs, did you ever do anything inappropriate with those children, in any form, at any time? Never, I said. I would sooner have cut off my hand. She studied me for a long moment. Then she said, good, because I think what's happening to you is not an accident, and I intend to prove it. For the first time in almost 3 weeks, I breathed. Margaret was methodical, in a way that Stacy, God bless her, had not had the time or resources to be. She started pulling threads. The first thing she noticed was the same thing she said she always noticed in cases that felt wrong. The timing made no sense. I had been a part of those children's lives for 3 years. Vanessa had been in the picture for 2. Why now, after all this time, had I suddenly become a danger? What changed 2 months ago? She asked me during our second meeting. I thought about it. I told her that Robert had mentioned, around September, that he and Vanessa had been arguing, that Vanessa had been pushing for them to relocate to Phoenix where her sister lived, and Robert had resisted because his life, his job, his father were all in Clarksville. Margaret wrote that down and said nothing, but I saw something shift behind her eyes. She had also started making calls, and what she found in the course of those calls made the hair on my arm stand up. Vanessa had been married once before. Her first husband's name was Gerald Marsh, and they had divorced 4 years ago. Gerald had a daughter from a previous relationship named Caitlin, who had been very close to Gerald's father, a man named Eugene Marsh, who was 71 at the time of the divorce. Margaret explained it carefully, the way you explain something that you need someone to hear without flinching. Vanessa had accused Eugene Marsh of inappropriate behavior with Caitlin during the period when the divorce was being finalized. The accusations were investigated and ultimately dropped, but Eugene had been effectively removed from Caitlin's life during the process. The divorce proceedings had used the accusations to characterize Gerald as coming from a family of questionable character, and Vanessa had received primary custody with minimal interference from Gerald's side of the family. She has done this before, Margaret told me, and she has done it to achieve a specific outcome. I felt something I hadn't expected to feel in that moment. Not relief exactly. More like the specific vertigo of a very terrible thing making sudden sense. We arranged a video call with Gerald Marsh, who now lived in Georgia with his new wife. He was a quiet man, clearly still carrying damage from what had happened. He told us that Vanessa was extraordinarily controlled in how she operated, that she never lost her temper, that everything she did was planned in advance. He told us that by the time he realized what was happening to his father, the accusations had already been formally submitted, and there was no clean way to fight them without looking like a son defending a guilty man. His father, Eugene, was still alive, living in an assisted care facility in Knoxville. Gerald said he hadn't fully recovered from what happened. It broke something in him, Gerald told us quietly, even after it was dropped. People don't forget. His neighbors, his church friends, the way they looked at him changed, and it never changed back. I thought about my own neighbors. I thought about Dale's expression in the visitation room. Margaret had also hired an investigator named Frank Collier, a former county sheriff's deputy who specialized in domestic cases. Frank was 61 years old, stocky, and spoke very slowly in a way that made you pay close attention to every word he chose. He had spent 2 weeks doing something he called neighborhood canvassing, and what he brought back was both vindicating and horrifying. 3 of Robert's neighbors had independently observed Vanessa's behavior with the girls in the months before Thanksgiving. One neighbor, a retired nurse named Carol Pitts, who lived 2 doors down, had seen Vanessa grab Sophie roughly by the upper arm in the driveway after a school pickup. hard enough that Sophie stumbled. Carol had almost said something. She told Frank she had talked herself out of it because she didn't want to interfere with someone else's parenting. A man named Dennis, who jogged past the house every morning, had noticed that the girls always seemed to retreat when Vanessa came outside, moving behind their father or toward the fence rather than toward their mother. He said he had chalked it up to a strict household. But now that you're asking, he told Frank, I never once saw them run to her. And Lily's third-grade teacher, a woman named Mrs. Kowalski, who had taught for 24 years and described herself as not easily rattled, told Frank that Lily had come to school with unexplained bruising on her forearm twice in October. Mrs. Kowalski had documented both instances. She had been preparing to file a report when the Thanksgiving incident occurred, and the entire focus of everyone's attention shifted to the grandfather. She told Frank something that I had to read twice before I could hold it. Lily had never once, in any conversation Mrs. Kowalski had with her, expressed anything but happiness and safety when talking about me. But in the weeks before Thanksgiving, Lily had begun saying things about home that worried her, that Daddy's wife had new rules, that some things were secrets now, that she wasn't supposed to talk about certain things that happened at the house, but the truly damning evidence came from Frank's digital work. Through legal channels, working with Margaret's office and a court order based on the established pattern with Eugene Marsh, Frank was able to examine Vanessa's electronic communications. What he found was a private online group she had created 11 months earlier. The group had 4 members, Vanessa and 3 women Margaret identified as close friends from her life before Robert. In this group, across 11 months of messages, Vanessa had discussed what she called the Walter problem, in terms that were so calculated they were almost clinical. She had discussed how my relationship with the girls gave Robert an anchor to Clarksville that she couldn't override through normal means. She had discussed the Phoenix relocation and Robert's refusal to leave his father and his daughter's grandfather behind. She had discussed strategies for eliminating what she called his excuse to stay rooted. One message, sent 8 months before Thanksgiving, read, Once Walter is gone from the picture, Robert has no reason to dig his heels in. The girls will adjust. Kids always do. Another message, sent 4 months before Thanksgiving, included photographs she had been quietly collecting of me interacting with the girls at various family events. Normal photographs, me holding Lily's hand crossing the parking lot, me hugging Sophie after her school play, me helping Lily with her jacket zipper. She had been building a portfolio, attaching her own written commentary to each one, framing ordinary grandfather behavior as something sinister, and the message sent 12 days before Thanksgiving read simply, Thursday. I've prepared everything. Walter won't see it coming. When Margaret showed me the printed screenshots across the table in her office, I sat with them for a long time without speaking. 11 months. For 11 months, while I had been bringing cookies and reading bedtime stories and teaching Sophie to identify constellations, Vanessa had been building the mechanism that would destroy me. Robert came to see me 5 days before the trial. He had finally found the blocked messages, dozens of my calls and texts that had been automatically filtered out of his phone by monitoring software Vanessa had installed, software that Frank had also discovered in his investigation. Robert's face when he sat down across from me looked like a man who had been underwater and had just broken the surface. He said, Dad, I am so sorry, and then he couldn't say anything else for a while. I told him I needed him to be strong for 2 more weeks. I told him I needed him to hold himself together for the girls and for what was coming. He nodded and pressed his hand against the glass, and I pressed mine against the other side of it, and that was enough for the moment. The trial began on a cold Tuesday morning in February, more than 2 months after Thanksgiving. I sat at the defendant's table in a suit Robert had brought me and watched the courtroom fill, and I felt the weight of every eye on the back of my neck like a physical pressure. The prosecutor laid out the case against me with careful, confident language. He described me as a man who had used the trusted position of grandfather to gain access to children. He described the photographs on my phone. He called Vanessa to the stand, and she was precisely what I expected: composed, soft-voiced, specific, and devastatingly believable. She described her concerns about my behavior in careful, measured language. She said she had tried to handle it within the family before feeling she had no choice but to act. She said she was a mother protecting her children, and that she would do it again. Margaret let her finish. Then she stood up. Mrs. Briggs Holloway, she said, using Vanessa's hyphenated name calmly. You mentioned photographs found on my client's phone as part of your concern. Are you aware that you personally requested those photographs via text message, asking my client to document your daughter Lily's allergic rash for the pediatrician while your husband was traveling? Vanessa's composure held. I may have asked him to take a few pictures, not the number that were on that phone. Margaret placed a text message exchange in front of the jury. This is your text to my client from August 14th. You wrote, Walter, can you get me good pictures of the whole rash? Dr. Patterson will want to see it all. Thank you. My client sent you back 16 photographs. You replied, perfect, thank you, sending to the doctor now. Does that refresh your memory? A small muscle moved near Vanessa's jaw. The context of the request doesn't change what was on the phone. The context of the request, Margaret said quietly, is the entire point. She walked Vanessa through each incident methodically. The closed bedroom door during Lily's reading time, Vanessa's own instructions, documented in a message to Robert. The basement time alone with Sophie. Vanessa had brought Sophie downstairs, told her grandfather was going to help her with a school project, and gone back upstairs. Each incident Vanessa had characterized as something to fear had been a situation she had either requested or created. Then Margaret called Gerald Marsh to the stand. Vanessa's ex-husband walked to the witness stand with the quiet, careful movements of someone who had learned to take up very little space. He looked at Vanessa once, and then did not look at her again for the entirety of his testimony. He described his father, Eugene, what he had been before the accusations, and what he had become afterward. He described the way Vanessa had operated during their marriage, the isolation, the control, the way she had maneuvered the divorce. He described his daughter Caitlin, who was 15 now, and had not seen her grandfather in 4 years, and asked about him regularly. In your assessment, Margaret asked him, were the accusations your ex-wife made against your father legitimate? The prosecutor objected. Margaret reframed the question. Gerald answered that he had known his father for 38 years, and that no part of what Vanessa had described had ever had any basis in reality. Then why did you not fight harder to defend him? Askey, Margaret asked gently. Gerald was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was even but barely. Because I didn't understand fast enough what was happening. And by the time I did, the damage was already done. My father's friends had heard the accusations. His church had heard. Once something like that is said about a person, even when it's proven false, you can never fully take it back. I didn't want the same thing to happen with a trial that might go the wrong way. He paused. I wish every day that I had fought harder. The courtroom was very quiet. Frank Collier took the stand after Gerald and walked the jury through the digital evidence with the patient, methodical precision of a man who had spent 30 years presenting evidence to skeptical audiences. He explained what the private online group was, how it had been lawfully obtained, and what it contained. He read excerpts from Vanessa's messages aloud in his slow, deliberate voice, and with each sentence the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Once Walter is gone from the picture, Robert has no reason to dig his heels in. Thursday. I've prepared everything. Walter won't see it coming. When the prosecutor attempted to challenge the authenticity of the messages, Frank walked through the forensic methodology with calm, unhurried specificity that made the challenge seem almost embarrassing. Then Robert took the stand. My son, who looked nothing like the man who had stood in the living room doorway and let them put handcuffs on me. He described the kind of father I had been. He described the kind of grandfather I had been to Lily and Sophie. He described what I had meant to him after Pauline died, and his voice broke once on his mother's name. And I looked at the table in front of me, because if I looked at my son, I would lose my composure entirely. He described finding the blocked messages. He described the monitoring software Frank had found on his phone and on his personal laptop. He described messages from his own college friends and from his pastor and from his sister in Austin that he had never received because Vanessa had filtered them out. When you found those blocked messages from your father, Margaret asked him, what did they say? Robert kept his eyes very steady. He told me he loved me. He told me he didn't understand what had happened. He told me that whatever I was being told, he needed me to know that the girls were the most important thing in his life and that he would never harm them. He stopped. There were 43 messages. Over 2 months. He kept trying. The courtroom was silent. When Vanessa was recalled for further questioning, something had shifted. The prosecutor beside her was quieter. Her own posture was fractionally less certain. Margaret approached her with the last piece of evidence. Mrs. Holloway, she said, I'm going to show you a message you sent to your friend on September 2nd of last year, 8 months before Thanksgiving. In it you wrote, Robert's only anchor here is the old man and those girls. I need to cut the anchor. Can you tell the jury what you meant by that? Vanessa said she didn't recall sending that message. Your phone's data shows it was sent from your device at 9:14 in the evening from your home address. She said she might have been venting. She said people said things in private they didn't mean. Did you mean it when you wrote 11 months before Thanksgiving, once Walter is gone from the picture? Something broke through Vanessa's composure then. It wasn't dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was a kind of flatness, a dropping of the careful construction she had maintained, and when she spoke, her voice had lost its warmth entirely. Walter was never going to let us have our own family. He was always there. Robert could never fully commit to our life because his father was always pulling him back. I was trying to protect my marriage. The courtroom went so still I could hear someone behind me breathe. By having an innocent man arrested, Margaret said. Vanessa didn't answer. By following the same playbook you used against Eugene Marsh 4 years ago. The prosecutor objected. The judge sustained it. It didn't matter. The jury had heard it. Margaret's closing was not long. She said that the evidence showed not a predatory grandfather but a methodical woman who had treated an innocent elderly man as an obstacle to be removed, and who had used the most devastating possible accusation to do it. She said that Walter Briggs's crime was being so loved by his grandchildren that his presence in their lives complicated someone else's plans. She said, "Don't let Vanessa's strategy succeed. Don't make this jury the final tool she needed." The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they came back, I held the edge of the table in front of me and looked straight ahead. Not guilty. I felt my vision blur. Margaret put her hand on my arm and kept it there while the room moved around us. Across the courtroom, I saw Robert with his face in his hands. Somewhere behind me I heard someone crying. I don't know who it was. I was not entirely present in my own body for several minutes. Vanessa sat very still, and then court officers approached her, because the perjury and evidence tampering charges that Margaret had filed as a parallel proceeding had been waiting for this moment. And I watched my daughter-in-law stand and walk out of that courtroom between 2 officers with the same controlled posture she had carried throughout. And I thought about Eugene Marsh and his assisted care facility in Knoxville, who had never gotten this moment. I thought about him every day for a long time afterward. The first morning back in my own house, I stood in the kitchen and made coffee and listened to the sounds of my own home for a long time. The refrigerator hum. A bird outside the window. Silence. That was mine. Robert brought the girls the following Saturday. I heard them before I saw them, their voices coming up the porch steps, and I opened the door before they could knock. Lily threw herself at me so hard I had to step back to keep my balance. Sophie hung back for exactly 3 seconds, looking at me with those serious eyes, and then she walked forward and put her arms around me and didn't say anything, which from Sophie said everything. We spent that afternoon in the backyard. I had put up a new bird feeder during my first week home, and the girls spent 40 minutes trying to identify every bird that came to it, using an old field guide of Pauline's that I found on the bookshelf. Robert sat next to me on the porch steps and we didn't talk much. There wasn't much that needed saying that hadn't already been said through the glass of a jail visitation window, with our hands pressed flat against opposite sides. "Dad," Robert said at one point, watching his daughters argue quietly over whether a particular bird was a house finch or a purple finch. "I'm sorry I didn't fight faster." I told him I understood. I told him that what Vanessa had built around him had been constructed very carefully over a long period of time, and that not seeing it didn't mean he had failed. He nodded, but I knew it would take him a long time to fully forgive himself. That's the other thing the Vanessas of the world leave behind. Not just the damage they aimed at their target, the guilt they plant in everyone who didn't stop them fast enough. Months have passed now. The rhythms of our life have found their way back, altered but real. Sophie still challenges me to name things. Presidents, state capitals, bird species. It doesn't matter, and I still try to beat her time. Lily has started teaching me the songs from whatever musical she's currently obsessed with, which means I now know more show tunes than any retired history teacher should probably admit to. Robert comes for dinner on Sundays and stays later than he needs to, and I don't point that out because I understand that he's still making sure I'm here. Margaret Holloway told me about a group that Gerald Marsh's current wife had started for families affected by what they called litigation abuse, which is the formal name for what Vanessa had done, using legal systems as weapons. I attended a meeting in a church fellowship hall in Nashville, and I sat in a room full of people who had versions of my story, and some of them had worse endings than mine, and some of them were still in the middle. And I told them what I knew, which wasn't very much except that the truth is worth fighting for even when the fight nearly finishes you. One evening in late summer, I was sitting on my back porch with Lily asleep against my side and Sophie stretched out on the porch boards, pointing her little telescope at the sky, and she said, "Grandpa, do you think Grandma Pauline can see us?" I thought about that for a moment. I told her I thought Pauline could see exactly what she needed to see, and that she would have been very proud of both of them, and that she would have had some things to say to Sophie about leaving fingerprints on a telescope lens. Sophie laughed and wiped the lens on her shirt and pointed it back at the sky. If you had asked me on that Thanksgiving night, standing in my son's foyer in handcuffs at 67 years old, whether I would sit on this porch again with these girls, I don't know what I would have told you. There were nights in that jail cell when I could not see any version of this future, when it took everything I had just to choose the next morning. But I want to tell you something, because I think it matters, because I think you are listening to my story for a reason. The people who build these structures of lies, they count on you not fighting. They count on the accusation being so overwhelming that you accept defeat rather than face the shame of the battle. Vanessa chose child abuse because she knew it would make me hesitate. She knew that even an innocent man might flinch from that fight. Don't flinch. The truth will not announce itself. It will not arrive on its own timeline. It requires someone willing to be humiliated and frightened and exhausted and still standing there, insisting on it. Margaret Holloway insisted on it with me. Robert found his way to insisting on it. Gerald Marsh, 4 years too late for his father, but determined that someone else's father wouldn't share that fate, insisted on it. And Sophie is out here on the porch insisting that the blurry point of light she keeps losing is definitely Saturn and not an airplane, and I'm going to sit here with her until she finds it. Now, I want to hear from you. If you had been in my son Robert's position, if you had slowly realized that the person you loved had done something this calculated to someone you had trusted your whole life, what would you have done? Drop your answer in the comments below and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has reached. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. Sometimes the heaviest thing a person can carry isn't injustice itself, it's the temptation to stop fighting it. What Walter's story teaches us is that love, patient and stubborn, and quietly insistent, outlasts even the most carefully constructed lie. Hold on to the people who press their hand against the glass for you. And if you haven't told them lately that you're grateful they're still there, tonight is a perfectly good time to start. A small note for you. This story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to entertain you while leaving something genuinely worth keeping, a small, warm reminder that truth and love are always worth the fight.